It began in the middle of the night while the world slept. A catastrophe whose radioactive cloud would spread across half of Europe started with a single fatal decision, the press of a button meant to stop a reactor, but which became its final breath. April 26, 1986. 1:23 a.m. Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Reactor. Number 4. Inside the control room, the hum of turbines fills the air. Green indicator lights flicker softly across steel panels. The men on duty are tired but focused. They are engineers, operators, scientists, products of a system that prized discipline, precision, and silence. For them, this night was supposed to be routine. The goal, to test whether the reactor's turbines could keep generating enough electricity to power the plant's cooling pumps during a loss of external power. A safety test in theory, one that had been postponed several times. But now, at night, under pressure from supervisors, it would finally be done. The RBMK-1000 reactor was a marvel of Soviet engineering, powerful, efficient, and, as officials like to say, indestructible. Yet hidden in its design was a flaw no one wanted to discuss. Under certain conditions, when the reactor operated at low power, it became dangerously unstable. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, led the team, calm, experienced, methodical. His colleague, Leonid Toptunov, only 25, was responsible for controlling the reactor's power level. Watching over them, sharp-eyed and impatient, stood Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. A man feared more than respected, demanding, driven, and utterly confident in the machine's perfection. As the test began, the reactor's power unexpectedly dropped too low. The correct procedure would have been to stop the test, but Dyatlov ordered otherwise. They would continue. He insisted the reactor could be stabilized manually. Control rods were withdrawn far beyond safe limits. Alarms flickered. Indicators began to flash red and Tucan AM. The reactor was in an unpredictable state, a sleeping giant ready to awaken. Steam pressure fluctuated, water levels dropped. Yet the operators, bound by orders and hierarchy, pressed on. In Soviet plants, questioning authority was not an option. At 1:23:04, the experiment proceeded. The turbines slowed. The cooling pumps began to lose speed. Steam formed in the reactor's fuel channels, blocking water flow. Pressure surged. Inside the core, reactivity spiked, a deadly feedback loop. 3:40. The emergency button, AZ5, was pressed. It should have shut the reactor down completely. Instead, the graphite-tipped control rods triggered a sudden burst of energy at the core's base. For a split second, the reactor went supercritical. 3:47. A sound like thunder ripped through the building. The reactor exploded. The first blast, a massive steam explosion, lifted the 1,200-ton reactor lid into the air. A second explosion followed, more violent, sending fragments of uranium fuel and glowing graphite high into the night sky. The roof of the building disintegrated. Fire burst through shattered concrete. Inside the control room, the men were thrown to the floor. Alarms screamed. Gauges spun wildly. Nobody understood what had happened. Akimov shouted over the noise, "The reactor has exploded!" But Dyatlov snapped back, "That's impossible! The reactor cannot explode!" Outside, a deadly blue light shimmered above the ruins, the eerie glow of ionized air. Burning graphite littered the ground. Workers, unaware of the danger, walked among the glowing fragments, picking them up with bare hands. Within hours, their skin would blister and peel away. At 1:30 a.m., the first fire brigade from the city of Prypiat arrived. Lieutenant Vladimir Prypiat, just 23 years old, led the team. They saw flames on the roof and thought it was a regular electrical fire. None of them wore protective suits. None of them knew they were walking into an invisible storm of radiation. They climbed the roof, aiming their hoses at the flames. A few minutes later, they began to feel strange, nausea, dizziness, a burning sensation in their faces. But they kept working. "We didn't know," one firefighter later recalled. "We were there to put out a fire. That's what we did." By dawn, every firefighter on that roof was fatally irradiated. Meanwhile, in Prypiat, a city of 50,000 people built to house the plant's workers, life continued as usual. The explosion had been heard by many, but no alarm was raised. The night air smelled metallic, strange. Some residents stood on their balconies, watching the orange glow on the horizon. Parents woke their children to see what they thought was a beautiful fire. By sunrise, radioactive dust settled over the entire city. It coated cars, playgrounds, gardens, and food stands. The radiation level in Prypiat was already 1,000 times higher than normal, yet no one had been told to stay indoors. At the plant, chaos reigned. Akimov and Toptonov descended into the lower levels, trying desperately to pump cooling water into the destroyed reactor. They waded through knee-deep water and debris, working in near darkness. Their skin turned red, their faces swollen. They kept working until they collapsed. Both would die in Moscow within weeks. The fire continued to rage. Flames reached 70 meters into the sky. The wind shifted northwest, carrying radioactive particles across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Within 24 hours, radiation would be detected, as far away as Sweden, forcing Soviet officials to admit that an accident had occurred. At 6 a.m., helicopters arrived. Pilots, unaware of the radiation intensity, flew directly over the open core, dropping sand, boron, and lead in an attempt to smother the fire. Each flight exposed them to deadly doses. Some would die within months, others would live with illness for the rest of their lives. The Soviet leadership in Moscow received the first reports around 4 a.m. An explosion at the Chernobyl plant. Fire contained. The truth was far worse. Yet, fearing panic, authorities chose silence. No evacuation, no public warning. By 10 a.m., radiation readings on site exceeded the measurable range of standard dosimeters. Instruments maxed out at 3.6 Röntgens per hour, but the real level near the reactor was more than 15,000. When Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina arrived later that day with a team of nuclear scientists, they were stunned. One officer told him quietly, "Comrade, our meters are useless here. The radiation is off the scale." Still, official television broadcasts made no mention of the explosion. In Prypiat, children played outside and weddings took place as planned. Only on the evening of April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion, did authorities finally order the evacuation. But on the first day, the day when it all began, there was only confusion, heroism, and death. The men who stayed behind at the plant, the firefighters, the engineers, they worked until their bodies failed. They didn't know the scale of the disaster. They only knew they had to stop it. By nightfall on April 26th, reactor number 4 was a glowing crater. Radiation poured into the sky, iodine, cesium, plutonium, poisoning everything it touched. The invisible cloud rose higher and higher, carried by the wind across Europe. Chernobyl had changed from a triumph of Soviet technology into a symbol of its deepest failure. That night, time seemed to stop. The men in the control room, Akimov, Toptonov, Dyatlov, all would die within weeks. But their final hours, their courage and mistakes, became the first chapter in a story that would forever redefine humanity's relationship with the atom. The night when time stood still had begun. and the world would never be the same. April 26, 1986, the sun rose over Prypiat, a city built for the workers of Chernobyl. 50,000 residents awoke to an ordinary morning, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. For them, it was just another day. Children preparing for school, buses moving along the wide avenues, shops opening their doors. At the heart of the city, the streets were already dusted with radioactive particles. Invisible and silent, the cloud from the exploded reactor number 4 drifted slowly northwest. No alarms had sounded, no warnings had been given. To the residents, the plant was a trusted neighbor, a symbol of Soviet achievement, not a source of invisible death. The first people to notice were the workers closest to the plant. Maintenance crews on the outskirts reported a strange, bitter smell in the air, a metallic, sweet scent that burned their noses and eyes. Firefighters returning from the initial blaze described a glowing bluish light above the reactor. Yet, this information was filtered, diluted, and delayed. Reports to city officials were met with calm reassurances. Everything is under control. In apartments and dormitories, families went about their routines. Mothers bathed their children. Fathers prepared for work. Grandparents tended gardens. Across Prypiat, people looked up at the orange glow in the sky and called it beautiful. Some walked to the river, unaware that the dust settling on the banks contained cesium and iodine. Others played in parks, kicked balls across empty streets, inhaling radioactive particles with each breath. Teachers in schools prepared lessons. Children laughed in classrooms, the sun streaming through windows dusted with radioactive debris. No one knew that this morning they had already been exposed to dangerous doses of radiation. By the end of the day, many would show the first subtle signs: nausea, headaches, fatigue. Symptoms so slight at first that they were dismissed as the flu or tiredness. In the early hours, city officials received conflicting information from the plant. Some engineers insisted it was a minor accident. Others spoke of explosions, fires, and radiation levels far beyond the scale of their instruments. Still, the message passed to the public was calm and controlled. The authorities feared panic more than contamination. Meanwhile, workers at nearby factories and construction sites noticed something unusual. Ash fell like fine snow on their clothes. Metal surfaces and cars were coated in a grey dust. Livestock in the outskirts of Prypiat began to act strangely. Birds fled in large flocks. Dogs barked incessantly. Local farmers were puzzled, but none of this prompted immediate alarm. Across the city, residents continued their routines. Cafeterias served breakfast. Markets sold bread and vegetables. Shops played music over loudspeakers, promoting normalcy. Some children cycled through streets already laced with radiation, unaware that the invisible particles would enter their lungs and bloodstream. By mid-morning, hospital staff began noticing an unusual number of patients reporting mild nausea and rashes. Doctors, however, were puzzled. They had no way to measure radiation levels accurately. The cases were sporadic and inconsistent. No pattern was immediately apparent. In the homes of plant workers, the mood was uneasy. Some had stayed at the plant all night, battling fires, pumping water into the shattered reactor, and now returned home with clothes still dusted in radioactive debris. They did not inform their families of the full danger. To them, secrecy was part of duty. Truth was a luxury that could not be afforded. At the local kindergarten, teachers gathered children for morning exercises. One instructor remembered, "The sun shone bright. We could see the glow from the plant. We were told not to worry. I did not know I was breathing radiation." Meanwhile, the wind carried the radioactive cloud beyond Ukraine. By afternoon, readings in Belarus and Western Russia began to rise. In Sweden, nuclear monitoring stations detected abnormal spikes in radiation. Yet in Prypiat, life continued as if nothing had happened. Streetcars rattled through the avenues, workers went to factories, and children played football in schoolyards. Even in the highest levels of local government, confusion reigned. Communication between the plant, city officials, and regional authorities was slow, fragmented, and contradictory. Some reports spoke of small fires, others hinted at massive destruction. Decisions were delayed. Orders from Moscow emphasized calm and concealment. By evening, the first buses were mobilized to evacuate plant workers, but citywide evacuation was still not considered necessary. Families remained at home. Dinner was served, television programs played, and laughter filled apartments. Outside, dust continued to fall from the sky, carrying iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 into homes and schools. Residents of Prypiat had no sense of the invisible danger growing in their midst. They were breathing in radioactive particles, their children absorbing contamination through skin contact and inhalation. This was the beginning of exposure that would have lifelong consequences, yet nobody knew it at the time. By nightfall, the city was oblivious to the magnitude of what had occurred. The radioactive cloud, the invisible killer, continued to drift, slowly over rooftops, rivers, and parks. It would travel thousands of kilometers, reaching Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. Yet in Prypiat, life appeared unchanged. Mothers tucked their children into bed, men returned from night shifts, and the city lights reflected off streets coated in lethal dust. This was the cruel paradox. The world's largest radiation accident was invisible. It could not be seen, felt, or smelled in ways that would trigger panic. People went about their lives while their bodies accumulated doses that would, in the coming hours, days, and weeks, start to wreak havoc on internal organs and immune systems. By the end of April 26th, not one official alert had been issued to the citizens of Prypiat. The first hints of danger were whispered by a few who had been at the plant all night, their faces pale and hands burned. But no one in authority communicated the severity. People slept in their apartments, unaware that they were already living in a radioactive cloud that would follow them across Europe for months. The night of April 26th ended quietly in Prypiat, but it was far from over. For the people who didn't know, it was the calm before the storm, a storm they could not see, could not sense, and could not imagine. The city slept, oblivious, while the invisible killer drifted silently through the streets. By the next morning, the first evacuation warnings would arrive, not as a public announcement, but as instructions to certain workers delivered with secrecy and fear. The residents of Prypiat were about to enter a world of uncertainty, terror, and displacement that would define their lives forever. The first responders arrived at reactor number 4 within minutes. They were ordinary men, firefighters, plant workers, and technicians whose duty was to protect life, property, and the plant itself. None of them knew the full scale of the disaster they were stepping into. The only measure they had was instinct, training, and loyalty. Lieutenant Vladimir Prypiat, just 23, led the first fire crews onto the roof. Flames licked the sides of the building, smoke poured from the shattered structure, and an unnatural blue glow danced across the rubble, ionized air signaling lethal radiation. Prypiat had no radiation suit, no warning. Only his experience and sense of duty guided him. The firefighters began to hose the burning graphite and oil. Within minutes, many began to feel nausea, dizziness, and skin burns. Their watches and dosimeters, designed for minor radiation exposure, were useless. The invisible enemy was already inside their bodies. Inside the plant, engineers like Alexander Akimov and Leonid Topchanov descended into the lower levels to manually pump water into the shattered cooling systems. The corridors were dark, flooded with debris and steam. Every step they took exposed them to doses of radiation that would guarantee death within days. Yet they persisted, focused only on one goal: preventing the rest of the plant from exploding. Dawn broke over the exclusion zone. More emergency personnel arrived. Helicopters began circling, pilots tasked with dropping sand, boron and lead directly onto the exposed core. Each flight meant exposure to hundreds of Röntgens per hour. Pilots and crews knew the risk, but had no choice. The reactor had to be contained, and every minute counted. Meanwhile, hospital staff in Prypiat began receiving the first victims. Firefighters and engineers arrived with vomiting, high fevers, and severe burns. Their skin blistered and peeled. Blood tests showed counts of white blood cells near zero. The doctors, unprepared for such extreme radiation exposure, struggled to understand what was happening. Some of the heroes did not survive the first week. Others would live only long enough to see the initial containment efforts succeed. Every action they took, every risk they accepted, was done in ignorance of how lethal the radiation was. And yet, without them, millions of lives in surrounding regions would have been endangered. Even ordinary plant workers who had survived the initial explosions faced deadly challenges. Some were sent onto the roof to remove chunks of burning graphite by hand. Others were instructed to seal cracks in the reactor's structure, working barehanded in direct contact with radioactive debris. These men were already doomed from the moment they entered the core area. Witnesses recalled seeing them glow faintly in the dark, a pale, eerie light emanating from their bodies, a sign of radiation poisoning no human eye should ever see. The heroism was undeniable, but so was the tragedy. By late April 26th, the first reports of radiation sickness reached Moscow. The Soviet leadership began to understand the scale of the disaster, but political concerns delayed broader public warnings. Meanwhile, the men on the ground continued their work, unaware that their own lives were being sacrificed in a slow, invisible death. Medical teams in Kiev and Moscow began preparing for the influx of patients. Treatment was experimental, often ineffective. Doctors attempted blood transfusions, bone marrow stimulation, and other measures, but the doses were already fatal. Many of the firefighters and engineers who had risked everything would not live to see the month's end. Yet the work continued. Each hour spent pumping water, throwing sand, or clearing debris was a fight not just against fire, but against the spread of radioactive material into the wider environment. The men who faced the reactor directly understood little of nuclear physics. Only the immediate reality: fire, smoke, debris, and the silent killer flowing unseen through the air. Families of the first responders were told only that they were working to stabilize the situation. The truth of radiation exposure, its lethality and its irreversibility, was concealed. Letters sent to relatives often described routine firefighting. Children, parents, and wives would later learn the true cost of their loved ones' courage, many of whom would die painfully within weeks. Despite all, small acts of heroism persisted. Firefighters helped each other down collapsing stairwells. Engineers supported exhausted colleagues in the heat of steam-filled tunnels. Pilots of helicopters flew mission after mission, knowing the exposure would likely kill them eventually. Each person acted without full understanding, yet with full commitment to saving others. By the morning of April 27th, it was clear: reactor. Number 4 had been contained, but only thanks to the sacrifice of ordinary men turned heroes. Their bodies bore the immediate cost, their lives shortened, but their courage prevented a far greater catastrophe. The surrounding towns and villages had been spared worse radiation exposure. Chernobyl's first heroes died unseen by the world. Their deeds were not reported, their faces unknown, yet without them, the scale of human tragedy would have been far greater. Theirs was a silent, invisible battle against forces no human could withstand, an act of courage in the truest sense. The end of Chapter 3. The night had passed, the first fires were dying, and the first heroes had fallen. But the disaster was far from over. Radiation would continue to drift, affecting the innocent, the unaware, and the unwitting. And for those who survived the initial catastrophe, a new, slow enemy had begun to work from within. The heroes without a chance had fought, and the world owed them a debt that time and history would never forget. By April 27, 1986, 24 hours after the explosion, the Soviet government faced a monumental crisis. Inside the Kremlin, top officials scrambled to understand what had happened. The initial reports from Chernobyl were fragmentary and contradictory. Some engineers described a minor fire, others spoke of a total reactor destruction. Moscow did not yet know the full scale of the radiation released, nor would it communicate it immediately. For citizens of Prypiat and surrounding villages, life continued in partial ignorance. Evacuations began, but they were conducted with secrecy, in small groups, and often without explanation. Residents were told they were leaving temporarily. Many did not take personal belongings, did not understand the duration or severity of the evacuation, and would never return home. The streets of Prypiat emptied, but the world remained largely unaware of the unfolding catastrophe. The Soviet Union's official stance was carefully curated: minimal disclosure, maximum control. Newspapers published vague statements about an accident at a power station without specifying the scale or danger. Television broadcasts provided images of calm workers and officials inspecting the plant, masking the horror. Reports to the international community were even slower. Within the government, a special commission was formed, led by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina, and scientists tasked with damage assessment and containment. Their first task was to measure radiation levels, a task made difficult by the fact that instruments often maxed out and could not record the true intensity. Readings at the reactor site reached tens of thousands of Roentgens per hour, yet in public statements, this information was reduced to vague assurances. The situation is under control. Misinformation was systemic. Even local doctors were instructed not to alarm patients. Hospital staff saw unprecedented symptoms: nausea, vomiting, burns, acute radiation sickness, but could only report vague medical terms in official logs. Families of exposed workers were misled. Firefighters who had risked their lives were told to rest, while in reality, their exposure guaranteed severe illness or death. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continued to spread beyond Soviet borders. Sweden, Finland, Austria, and other countries detected abnormal radiation levels as early as April 28th. Swedish nuclear authorities measured iodine-131 and cesium-137 levels hundreds of times above normal. Alarmed scientists contacted Moscow for confirmation, but the Soviet government remained silent. The first formal acknowledgement would not come until April 29th, when radio stations reported a radiation accident in Chernobyl. By then, the invisible contamination had traveled across much of Europe. Inside the plant, containment efforts proceeded under immense secrecy and danger. Helicopters dropped tons of sand, lead, and boron into the open reactor, while crews worked in lethal radiation. Engineers manually shoveled radioactive graphite from the roof. Each step, each hour, was a gamble with death. Yet the government's priority remained: protect the system, protect the image of the state, protect the narrative. Human lives were secondary. International reaction, when it eventually came, was a mix of confusion and alarm. satellite images, detected the damaged reactor. Radiation readings in Europe were undeniable. Governments asked questions. The Soviet Union responded with tightly controlled statements, minimizing the severity, insisting the situation was under control, and delaying evacuation or warning for nearby areas beyond the immediate 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Inside Moscow, officials debated how much to reveal. Some scientists argued for full disclosure, citing public health risks. Others warned that admitting the truth would damage credibility and invite political backlash. Ultimately, secrecy won. Evacuations were conducted quietly, citizens were misinformed, doctors and journalists were silenced, evidence was carefully controlled, and images of the destruction were restricted. Yet, despite the cover-ups, information could not be contained entirely. Foreign news agencies began reporting unusual radiation levels across Europe. Farmers in Scandinavia noticed contamination in livestock. Sweden publicly criticized the Soviet Union for delay and secrecy. Pressure mounted. Only under international scrutiny did the USSR begin to acknowledge the true scale of the disaster. Within the affected areas, the consequences of misinformation were immediate. People returned to contaminated fields, continued to consume radioactive milk, and lived in homes dusted with fallout. Long-term exposure would lead to thyroid cancers, leukemia, and other illnesses, outcomes directly linked to the delay in accurate warnings. For the scientists and engineers inside the government, frustration was intense. Many knew that lives could have been saved with earlier, honest disclosure. They worked tirelessly to stabilize the reactor, manage evacuation logistics, and monitor radiation spread, all while maintaining the facade of calm for the outside world. By early May, the world was aware that a major nuclear accident had occurred, yet even then, the full scale remained obscured. The Soviet Union's narrative was controlled. It was a technical accident, contained with minimal human impact. In reality, thousands of people had already been exposed to lethal radiation, and the invisible effects would continue to unfold for decades. The deception extended to scientific publications and data. International researchers were often denied access to raw measurements. Soviet studies released to the public downplayed contamination levels. It was a conflict between truth and political expedience, a choice that cost thousands of lives and delayed critical safety measures. Despite the lies, the disaster left traces impossible to erase. Evacuated cities remained empty, the landscape scarred, and radiation spread silently across borders. Human stories emerged slowly, firefighters and engineers who had died, children growing up with contamination, families relocated forever. The world began to realize that Chernobyl was not merely a technical failure. It was a failure of governance, transparency, and ethics. By the end of Chapter 4, the reactor was partially contained, the international community alert, and Soviet authorities maintaining tight control over information. Secrets and lies had shaped the early response, but the invisible truth of radiation exposure continued to affect lives, a truth that no amount of censorship could erase. Chernobyl had entered a new phase. Containment of the reactor was underway, but the long, silent impact of the disaster was only beginning, and the world had learned too late the cost of secrecy. Years after the explosion at reactor number 4, the world would slowly begin to understand the true scale of Chernobyl. The radioactive cloud had crossed borders, affected millions, and left a legacy that would endure for decades. But perhaps the greatest damage was not just physical. It was the erosion of trust, the price of secrecy, and the human stories that were nearly lost to silence. In Prypiat, once vibrant streets now lay abandoned. Buildings decayed, playgrounds froze in time, and personal belongings remained in apartments as if their owners had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone became a ghost city, a monument to what had been lost. Families that had once walked its streets were scattered across the Soviet Union, many never to return. The human cost was immense. Firefighters, engineers, and plant workers who had acted heroically perished within days or weeks. Survivors suffered from radiation-induced illnesses, thyroid cancers, leukemia, and other conditions that emerged years later. Pregnant women exposed to fallout bore children with health complications. Entire communities faced psychological trauma, the anxiety of invisible danger, the uncertainty of relocation, and the weight of mistrust toward authorities. Internationally, the catastrophe forced governments to re-evaluate nuclear safety. Sweden, Finland, and other European countries monitored radiation levels closely, revealing the delayed response of Soviet authorities. Scientists, journalists, and policymakers criticized the lack of transparency, and the world recognized the need for international safety standards, disaster protocols, and independent monitoring. Inside the Soviet Union, survivors struggled to understand the silence and deception. Official records often minimized radiation exposure. Many families discovered only later the fate of the men who had saved the plant, and by extension, millions of lives. Memorials for firefighters and engineers would only emerge years after the disaster, honoring courage that had been invisible. For too long, children who had been exposed in 1986 grew up in an uncertain shadow. Educational programs, health monitoring, and research eventually followed, but the damage had already occurred. Radioactive particles had entered soil, rivers, and food chains, creating long-term environmental hazards. The true ecological impact would take decades to study, with abandoned forests and mutated wildlife standing as silent witnesses. Politically, Chernobyl left an enduring mark. The Soviet government's secrecy eroded public trust. Citizens learned that information was controlled, not for safety but to preserve an image. For many, the disaster became a symbol of systemic failure, of politics prioritized over human life. Even decades later, the story of Chernobyl carries lessons for the world. Nuclear energy remains powerful and dangerous. Transparency, preparedness, and accountability are vital. Ignorance and concealment can transform technical failure into human catastrophe. Survivors tell their stories cautiously, with a mixture of grief and pride. "We did what we had to do," one firefighter said years later. "We saved lives, even though we knew the cost." Researchers continue to study the fallout, mapping contamination, assessing health impacts, and learning how ecosystems recover. Films, documentaries, and books preserve the memory of those who acted and suffered, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. Chernobyl remains a warning. The invisible threat of radiation, combined with human error and deception, can devastate generations. The ghosts of Prypiat, the names of fallen heroes, and the scars of the land endure as a testament to courage, tragedy, and the price of silence. By the end of the 20th century, the Chernobyl exclusion zone had become both a scientific research area and a symbol of caution. Tourists visit its abandoned streets. Scientists collect samples of soil, water, and flora, and historians continue to piece together the human stories lost in the initial secrecy. The disaster revealed both the limits of human control over technology and the consequences of suppressing truth. It showed that the invisible can kill silently, that lies prolong suffering, and that memory is essential for justice, learning, and honoring those who risked everything. In the end, Chernobyl's story is not just about radiation, explosions, or government failure. It is about human lives. The victims, the heroes, and the millions affected by invisible forces they could not see. It is about courage in the face of the unimaginable and the enduring cost of silence. The world remembers, and those who survived continue to bear the legacy of a disaster that was as human as it was technological.